Leaders rarely notice the exact moment when familiar ground begins to thin beneath their feet. What they notice instead is a gradual shift in how they experience the work. A conversation that feels slightly out of rhythm, a routine decision that requires unexpected effort, an emerging sense that the explanations which once brought coherence no longer account for everything happening around them. The surface of the work looks unchanged, yet something in its texture feels different. The leader begins to sense this long before they can name it. Thresholds often announce themselves not through crisis, but through a subtle change in how the leader pays attention. Decisions that once rested comfortably within known categories begin to resist the usual sorting. The leader hesitates where they once moved quickly, not out of fear, but because they can feel that the familiar tools are no longer giving them a clear view. The work is still recognizable, but it no longer fits as tightly around their instincts as it once did. Something is shifting, and the leader can feel the pull of that shift before they can understand its direction. Part of what makes thresholds easy to miss is that everything external can continue as if nothing has changed. The same people gather, the same objectives remain, the same vocabulary is used to make sense of the work, yet beneath that continuity, the leader senses misalignment. Not failure, not dysfunction, just a quiet awareness that the patterns that used to guide them are no longer fully calibrated to the present moment. Leaders often experience this as an increasing sensitivity to signals that they might have once overlooked. A teammate's question stays with them a little longer than expected. A conversation reveals a tension that was always there but is now harder to ignore. A decision that feels simple on paper carries an undercurrent that suggests something deeper is at play. But these are not distractions. They are early signs that the landscape is changing shape. The threshold moment does not ask the leader for dramatic action. It asks them to notice. It asks them to slow their internal pace enough to recognize that they are standing in a place where the old assumptions are losing their accuracy. It invites the leader to resist the urge to patch over the discomfort with quick answers or familiar instincts. Instead, it encourages them to observe their own shifting posture and to trace what the shift might be revealing. But it's not enough for leaders to simply sense a threshold. They must understand why the moment matters. Thresholds are important because they offer leaders a rare kind of early warning. Not a warning of danger, but a warning that their inner framework is being asked to grow. When leaders name that they are at a threshold, they interrupt the reflex to force coherence too quickly. They give themselves permission to reconsider assumptions, reassess the environment, and relearn the work from a slightly different vantage point. Without that recognition, leaders often cling to strategies that are quietly losing their usefulness or double down on patterns that no longer support the emerging reality. Recognizing a threshold also helps leaders avoid misinterpreting the moment. Without language for what they're experiencing, leaders often describe their thresholds as fatigue, frustration, or personal inadequacy. They assume something is wrong with them rather than noticing that something around them is changing. Naming the threshold releases the leader from that false conclusion. It reframes the discomfort as a natural part of transition rather than a sign of decline. If you're awake and paying attention, threshold moments, the moments when leaders recognize when they stepped out of the familiar and into uncharted territory. Threshold moments are a preparation to meet emerging futures with steady eyes. When leaders understand that they're standing in an in-between space, They become more receptive to signals that reveal what the next season requires. They begin to listen differently. They move with a little more care. They pay attention to the places where the old story is loosening and where the new one is beginning its quiet work. A threshold is not a dramatic crossing. It is a recognition that the familiar is no longer the full story, and that the work ahead will require the leader to see, think, and engage with a depth that cannot be rushed. Naming the moment doesn't solve it, but it allows the leader to walk through it with clarity rather than confusion, and with humility rather than urgency. Thresholds matter because every meaningful turning in leadership begins long before the leader can see where it leads. The recognition is not the transformation, but it is the doorway through which transformation becomes possible.